Pack all your troubles in your own big bag and fire, fire, fire.
I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies, I know it's been a while, but I'll tack on an update at the end as to why. But today I want to talk about the latest in a long string of stupid conversations, most of which that we've had before, that are occurring within the gaming community. This time, it's about wheelchairs and disability in fantasy games, or more specifically D&D. Now, I'm against this idea within this very specific sort of area, not because I hate disabled people or want to remove inclusion and representation in RPGs, but people are going to get the wrong idea anyway and think it's about that when it isn't, as I've encountered repeatedly on this and many other topics. So please just actually listen to what I'm saying. Just listen.
Because it's going to be very intelligent and quite interesting and humane.
See, the problem here is that people are making two separate arguments, and this occurs quite often. One side is making an argument about inclusion and identity, really, when you get down to it. And this is all motivated by entirely lovely and fluffy reasons and wanting people to feel at home in the game and so on. You know, that's all perfectly lovely and nice, but it runs up against opposition, not because people hate the disabled, but because they're making an argument about verisimilitude, pragmatism, immersion, plausibility, and consistency within game worlds, right? It's the same as how maybe you're setting a game historically, perhaps, and you want to be inclusive of people who are homosexual, for example, but the history at the time was not particularly inclusive or nice, and people could be locked up for sodomy or whatever else. So do you rewrite history, which kind of insults everyone who suffered through these kinds of regimes in the past, or do you represent the world as it actually was? Or if you're writing a fictional game, if this is a post-apocalyptic setting where humanity is on the brink of dying out, would that society necessarily be particularly okay with homosexuality or not? Do the circumstances dictate the degree of tolerance or intolerance, and does it say anything about the person writing the game, creating the game world, that their world is intolerant? Or can that be separated? You know, so it's those kind of things that really kind of get in the way of having the argument, because you're treating disability as an identity and you're wanting to be inclusive of people who are disabled and so on. Lovely, fluffy, nice, charming motivations that they are. Other people are, by and large, not having that argument. They're not saying that disabled people shouldn't be able to play, or characters shouldn't be able to be disabled, or whatever else. No, they're making this argument about verisimilitude, pragmatism, immersion, plausibility, and consistency within the game world. Now, I can grant the people on the other side of the argument from me their ideas because I understand where they're coming from.
You mean you can see into my mind?
Yes.
And?
It amazes me how you manage to live in anything that small.
But there's no reciprocity here. There's not even an attempt to understand the opposite point of view. Even if you go to great pains and great lengths to explain it and what the problems with their point of view are, particularly within a particular game setting like vanilla D&D or the Forgotten Realms or whatever, and their reaction to your objections is not actually to your objections, it's an assumed objection, and then they become incredibly hostile, and that reaction invites further hostility and frustration and annoyance, right? Because you're not making the argument that they're responding to. I'm not sure whether this makes sense in a world with ubiquitous healing magic. You just hate disabled people. Or why would you choose to play someone disabled if you don't have to in a game that's at least partially about wish fulfillment? Just because you're in a wheelchair in real life doesn't mean that your character has to be. What's the deal there? You just hate disabled people. No, there's no reciprocity, there's no attempt to understand. The best you get is excuse making and post hoc justification that often gets quite tortured as to why they want people with wheelchairs to be in their game, right? So I guess I should establish some bona fides. I have disabled friends. I have a long-term mental illness, which gives me a strong disabled identity. If I could wave a magic wand and do away with my problems, I would. A lot of people I know who are disabled would do the same. I asked around, and a couple of people have stated that they just cannot understand why anyone would not take the opportunity to play something different than themselves. And I think that applies to a lot of games and a lot of gamers. They separate their character's identity from themselves. They treat it as wish fulfillment. They play as something different. They want to walk a mile in another man's shoes, because that way you're a mile away from them and you have their shoes. Right. That said, I'm going to try and lay out why this argument makes no sense, at least in the context in which it's taking place. Even though, as we've established, nobody is going to listen to the actual argument that I'm making.
Oh, well, who wants to live forever?
First, let's establish a little bit of context, shall we? And let's narrow down exactly what we're talking about so that the argument doesn't wander away too much. All of this seems to be stemming from the increasingly strident shrieking of a disabled activist and cosplayer who has constantly been bombarding Wizards of the Coast and anyone else who will listen with demands to be made part of a gaming stream or to be taken on as a consultant or a community manager or whatever else. That's irrelevant, okay? However annoying and shitty that person seems to be, it's irrelevant to the point. So this isn't about personality. I just know someone's going to bring that up at some point and point to that person and say, look, they're awful, therefore this argument is shit, which is a stupid ad hominem argument, right? Here are the baseline assumptions in the argument as it's going on at the moment. It's about D&D. It's about by the book D&D, which largely means a sort of vanilla high magic environment, Forgotten Realms-ish in terms of content, right? That is kind of D&D's home setting, I suppose. So this is a high magic environment. There is magic everywhere that you look. There are multicultural societies wherever you look. There's not so much technology, but there is magic. But there is some technology. It just seems to be much slower to grow. It's kind of medieval, but populations are a bit high, life expectancy is a bit high. All of this is a result of magic. D&D is a fairly crunchy system, even though it's not particularly realistic. It has a lot of different moving parts that interlink together, and its various systems also have impacts on the game world and the things that are established in the game world, so that if you remove one part, it will knock on to other parts. Like, say you have an engine and you remove the spark plugs, well, you're going to have to find some other way to ignite the fuel, right? Maybe if it's diesel, there is an opportunity for using gunpowder to start military diesel engines, which is quite fascinating. But the point is that you have to find another workaround, and then that might have a knock-on effect somewhere else, right? So you're no longer using petrol, you're using diesel, and so on and so on and so on and so on. You mess with one thing and it has an impact on everything else. You have to be... This is something I think you need to emphasize to a lot of people when it comes to game design. You have to be a systems thinker. You have to intuit or understand or work through how the different bits and pieces work together. And setting impacts rules and rules impact setting, right? Because there are implications from one upon the other. So, in a vanilla D&D setting, by the book, where there's a lot of magic washing around, where there's clerics and artifacts, healing magic is common, and so on. All of the things that allow D&D villages and towns not to be festering hellholes of plague, all of those things that exist, that they're important and they have bearing upon this question. The city of Baldur's Gate canonically has a population of around 25,000, I believe, which is roughly the same as Faerham in the UK, and if I tweak the numbers a bit, we're looking at a good handful of temples and perhaps 700 clerics across the city. The implications of that are that just the clerics within Baldur's Gate could heal all 1.2 million people in the UK who are quadraspazzed on a life glug in about 9 months. That's not even counting druids, arcane devices, artifacts, and so on, other ways of dealing with this. So clearly, there's going to have to be a very good reason why there are any cripples in the world at all. Because healing magic is so ubiquitous, and because there are lawful good, chaotic good, neutral good clerics who could quite obviously lose their powers if they fail to heal people who are in need. And it's not like this is a constant demand either. You can do it just once. And while you might not be able to get a cleric of a high enough level in your village, the next town or the city, somewhere you can make a pilgrimage to, is going to. So there is really no reason for anyone in the standard sort of vanilla D&D setting to be blind, to be missing a limb, to be confined to a wheelchair or anything else, which makes pirates a lot less fun, but this is the implications of the availability of magic. Possible ways to heal such an injury that would leave you in a wheelchair: regeneration, obviously, if you've actually lost a limb, greater restoration, lesser restoration, which is only a level 2 spell. That would be enough from a strict reading of the text of the spell. According to one of these people I was arguing with, the average level of a cleric within the published modules is something like around level 12. That's going to be more than enough for those lower spells, and that's the average. So there's plenty above that level and there's plenty below that level. You're only going to need 3rd level clerics for the lowest level spell to heal paralysis, then maybe 9th, which is below that 12, or level 13, which is only just above that 12. So there is really no reason whatsoever for there to be any cripples or blind people or anyone else who's disabled in any standard vanilla D&D world. It's as if there were a flock of Jesuses. Jesai? Everywhere, all the time. Just, healing lepers left and right. And it takes plot. It takes a story. It takes something really drastically different to go against that. Whether it be a widespread disease, a plague, or someone with a permanently debilitating injury. It's going to have to be something more.
No, please. Put down the jawbone.
Now, real wheelchairs, they're quite modern. They didn't really take off until the early 20th century. Really after World War I, when a lot of people were left crippled and debilitatingly injured. There were things like the bath chair before then, but wheelchairs as we think of them only really became widespread there. Prototypes existed in the early modern period, which is slightly ahead of where D&D is technologically. And prior to that, people in ancient China and so on were carted around in wheelbarrows or palanquins. But there's practicalities, right, to consider. And Madragons isn't going to cut it for various reasons. The existence of magic, the existence of dragons, the existence of various fantastical elements within the world is actually more of a problem for the argument for wheelchairs than against it. I mean, one of the arguments people make is, oh, well, can't I have a magical floating wheelchair? The cost of that artifact, the development time it would take to create it, or to research a new spell, Tensor's floating crip, or whatever, is more than it would take to just get the injury healed. So we can discount that, because why not just get your body fixed at that point anyway? And how exactly is a dungeon adventurer supposed to work with a wheelchair? How is that supposed to work? Stairs, cobblestones, sewers, narrow doorways, narrow passages, caves, mountains. You know, your capability to adventure is pretty much done. Now, you could make an argument. Perhaps you play a crippled wizard who is carried around in a palanquin by 4 muscular, oiled henchmen, something like that. That might be interesting, might play into the kind of fat merchant or indolent sorcerer meme that exists, trope that exists within pulp novels and lower end fantasy novels. But again, you're really working to justify the existence of cripples in a world where it doesn't make sense for them to exist.
Do you expect mercy here?
And I guess that kind of brings us back around to motivation here. See, the arguments that people are making, the reason they're so tortured and why they don't work and why they don't make sense and why they break the rules and the implication of the rules for the setting and so on, is because they're not approaching disability as a disability, they're approaching it as an identity category. And the people who might or might not be crippled in their real life but want to play cripples, you know, the question is, why are you choosing to play someone like that? What's the motivation behind that? Why are you pushing so hard to play a character that can't adventure, that the games master and the other players will have to work around in massive ways to make it happen? You know, wheelchair accessible dungeons are not particularly going to be a thing, right? I mean, there are other games, other genres that this all works in. I want to end on that note though. But what it seems to be, though I'm not claiming to read anyone's mind to this depth, it seems to be almost fetishism. And there is a fetish, or a mental condition. Well, there are fetishes around disability, loss of limbs, things like that. But there's also a mental condition, body integrity dysphoria, which can lead people to deliberately cripple themselves. There are people who've poured bleach in their eyes or deliberately thrown themselves off things aiming to injure themselves, to break their back, or to cause themselves an injury that would require amputation, that sort of thing. I don't think there's any denying the genuineness of the motivation when someone deliberately mutilates themselves. But that seems not too far away here from this weird fetishism of disability as an identity and a desire to thrust it into games. You know, that... it's slightly creepy. More than slightly creepy.
Isn't that rather unethical behaviour?
Oh, is it? I'm afraid I'm a bit out of touch.
I want to end on a more positive, upbeat sort of note. Look, if you want to play these kind of characters, if you want to explore these kinds of stories, there are better games for it. D&D at least vanilla D&D or the main published settings D&D, is just manifestly unsuited to this because of the ubiquity of healing magic and other ways of dealing with these issues. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay works better. It has critical tables. You could well lose a limb and end up needing a peg leg or something. You know, that makes sense, and it's more fitting with the sort of grim, dark reality that we see there. My own grim, dark setting, rule setting comes later, will be out soon, which is a grittier form of D&D rules that would work for this. Iron Kingdoms has fairly extensive rules for sort of steam-powered and magitech prosthetics and so on. You might want to play your character in that. There are plenty of other options if these are things that you want to explore. But in D&D, if you remove the capability of clerics and so on to heal this kind of injury, it's gonna have all manner of knock-on effects. D&D really isn't the place to do this or to explore this kind of thing. A handful of admittedly very cool miniatures besides. This just isn't the place to do it as written. You need a more low magic setting or a pulp fantasy setting. Something more brutal and grim and nasty where you can't get resurrected for 1,000 gold pieces, for example. Zang. Quick little update, housekeeping. I realise it's been over a week since I did a video and I haven't done either of my Monday live streams either. I'm pretty burnt out. I've had a lot of work, not just my own work, there's a lot of freelancing stuff on video editing and so on, plus doing the live streams twice a week of Dragon Warriors and once a week of Eratech. That's been quite draining, massively emotionally satisfying, but also quite draining. And I'm trying to get a whole bunch of different projects completed and done and out the way, because I've finished a whole bunch of editing and layout is laborious and boring. And that's what I'm kind of stuck on. So I took all the mornings off last week to get caught up a bit. So the next Eratech is coming out today. And the Grimdark rules are written and edited and done, so they need to be laid out. So I don't know whether I'm going to do completely back to my full schedule of videos this week, but I will try and be next week. But I am very tired, very burnt out, very overworked. That's a nice position to be in, particularly right now. But if I don't keep the channel going, YouTube will begin to penalise me. So I'm going to try and get something out and get back to something like my regular schedule. But I am very tired of these arguments, tired of the constant battles, tired of the political situation, tired from having too much to do, and a twinge of the old depression making me unsatisfied with everything that I do. So yeah, bit of a mix. Anyway, I will zang you again and leave you to get on about your day. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.